80 cents and volume was only moderate. On the American exchange, an average share dropped 26 cents. Several congressional investigations of the Penn Central situation have been proposed, one by Senator Hartke, head of the Surface Transportation Subcommittee.
The expert body, according to Congress, of course, involved and entrusted with the regulation of the railroad industry is the Interstate Commerce Commission. And that's the body to whom this committee is looking for information concerning the present financial circumstances concerning the Penn Central.
We don't manage the railroad.
I'm not talking about management. You have absolute control, and that is the very purpose of the Interstate Commerce Commission is to regulate them.
Where do we get absolute control? We only have such authority as the Congress has delegated to us.
Look, a whole corporation's gone bankrupt here. Have you made any effort? Did you make any effort to have since the merger? What happened? What did you do? I mean, did you just let it go and just die and not make any effort to find out what the causes and what was going on here? Did you think that the public had any concern? Everyone's telling us now that the whole United States of America transportation system depends on the taxpayer coming in and allocating $750 million, which anyone who understands is going to add $750 million ultimately to the national debt, $750 million at least, and everyone agrees that's probably just the beginning. The public have a right to know what you have done, charged with the responsibility of regulating the transportation industry when such a catastrophe occurred? Or don't you consider it much of anything?
Senator, you're making a speech. I can't respond to anything.
Well, I'll tell you, I might make another one after this is over about the ICC.
Penn Central, like every other railroad, concentrates on its freight service because that's where the money is, either by chance or by design. But there are problems there, too. Shippers say Penn Central freight cars are late, or get lost, or get sent to the wrong place. Freight cars have come back where they started, still loaded with the original cargo after weeks of apparently random travel. In the largely neglected passenger area, there's a bright spot, the Metroliner. The Metroliner is the first really first-class popular price train developed by the Penn Central in years. It runs between New York and Washington, and it's fast, faster than regularly scheduled trains. And it's dependable and clean. The scramble people go through to get on it every day is proof of what a railroad can do to improve passenger service when it wants to. The rest of Penn Central's passenger trains seem to be demonstrations of what a railroad can do to abolish passenger service when it's determined to do that. Penn Central's train number 63 rolled through Ohio yesterday on its way to Chicago. It had 2 passenger cars. One was deserted and 10 people sat in the other one. 4 of them were on railroad passes.
I know used to you could set your watch for these passenger trains when they was running there when I first went to work on the railroad. So I think they could get to business if they just go out for it.
You can't set your watch by most Penn Central passenger trains anymore, and the passengers seem to be getting the business. It used to be unheard of for a passenger train to be stopped while a freight went by. Now it happens all the time. So passengers usually arrive late in addition to their other discomforts. For these reasons, among many others, there are not many long-distance passengers anymore, and the Penn Central is petitioning the ICC to allow it to get rid of most of the rest of them. Steve Delaney, NBC News, reporting.
In the New York area, the Penn Central wants to get rid of its commuter lines because they lose money. There are 70,000 commuters who ride the railroad into New York each day. They board their trains at small stations in Westchester County and Connecticut. These commuters know the Penn Central is the largest line in the nation, but
trains don't run on schedule. They leave on time, they don't arrive on time. We've often sat on a train for half, 3/4 of an hour, and the conductor will come through and someone will say, what's happened? And they won't even give you the courtesy of an answer.
Well, it's gotten better, but the past winter's been terrible. Well, you get used to it. Well, I could drive if I want to, but who wants to drive into Manhattan every day?
in 39 years, have you seen a radical change?
Well, not for the better. The equipment appears to be in bad shape. They have trouble maintaining the schedule.
There's no excuse for running cars like this. A whole train of these old cars. I'm sure they could put a few modern cars in these trains.
In this yard at North White Plains, old and disabled Penn Central Railroad cars are repaired and refurbished. But complete modernization is often impossible. Some of the coaches were built in 1910. On the New Haven coaches, it's not a question of repairing the air conditioning, because there is none. It's a problem of making the fans work better. The railroad says that last year it spent $268 million on maintenance. This year, they say, they're spending more on repairs because they hope to get money from the government.
Well, this car isn't too comfortable. They used to have better cars on this than they do now.
Were you surprised to hear that the Penn Central had gone into bankruptcy?
Not at all. Not one bit.
I'm fed up with the whole thing.
Consumers of all kinds are griping these days. There's a group in Chicago which has been trying to get supermarkets to date their products so that things which are less fresh can be marked down. Today, they had a confrontation with one of their targets.
Road finally began to notice that when its boxcars got onto the tracks of a tiny railroad in Illinois called the LaSalle and Bureau County, the LS and BC, a lot of them never came back. Well, today, the FBI has found a number of them repainted in the colors of the LS and BC, and their numbers changed.
The LaSalle and Bureau County Railroad is among the smallest in the country. Today, it is also probably the quietest. Not one train moved across its track this morning. Traffic was stopped by an FBI search for 277 stolen Penn Central Railroad freight cars traced to the little LS and BC line. It was here in LaSalle, Illinois, that some of the stolen boxcars were found. How they and other Penn Central cars got here is a confusing tangle of corporate business. Late last year and early this year, Penn Central returned some of its leased freight cars to their owner, the Equitable Life Assurance Society. Equitable is one of Penn Central's biggest creditors. The insurance company, with little real need for trains, sold more than 400 of these cars to a New Jersey firm, Diversified Properties Incorporated. Diversified Property officials prefer not to talk at the moment. But the company apparently arranged to have the freight cars delivered to the LaSalle and Bureau County Railroad, a small line with interconnecting track to bigger railroads. LaSalle then shipped the cars down its own 15 miles of track to the Magna Earth Company, which leases and operates the Little Line's repair shop. Here, the old Penn Central cars were repaired and repainted. Somehow, the legitimate transfer of 400 freight cars became mixed in with the theft of 277 other cars, which were still owned by the Penn Central. They, too, were fixed, painted over, and those stolen cars were found operating in Illinois under the wrong name and on the wrong track. Who sent them here and why are unanswered questions. Peter Nolan, NBC News, Chicago.
The Washington Post reports that the police in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of Washington, set up a concealed television camera in the apartment of a 20-year-old woman with her agreement and consent. Then the police...
camera and new high-speed Ektachrome film, and they can actually take movies without movie lights, without any special lighting. Drop the film in the camera and shoot, just by the lights that are there. Give your family a new Kodak XL movie camera for movies without movie lights. From Kodak.
The Interstate Commerce Commission today made public a long bill of particulars against the bankrupt Penn Central Railroad. It said the merger of the Pennsylvania and the New York Central Railroad into Penn Central had resulted in total chaos, and that this total chaos in turn had led to $100 million in unpaid bills, $400 million in excessive labor costs, bad rail operations, and ultimately bankruptcy and reorganization. Amtrak, a government corporation, was set up for the precise purpose of avoiding such situations and to provide the country with better rail passenger service. But it too is in trouble.
When Amtrak took over the nation's passenger trains, its goal was to provide better service and better trains to attract enough riders to break even. But after 7 months, Amtrak is in serious financial trouble because not enough people have been willing to ride its trains.
We're operating on what seems to be a kind of a par for services of this sort. The costs seem to run about twice the revenues. Well, it's a very heavy fixed base business, and if you can double the ridership or treble the ridership, very little additional capital is required, and you've got a chance of coming out. So it's a matter of whether people will ride the trains.
Amtrak has until June of 1973 to prove itself, or Congress may dump passenger train service altogether. There are a lot of problems to be solved. It is still very complicated and difficult to get reservations and tickets. New computer systems have fouled up.
Broadway Limited, Chicago, coaches up ahead.
Passenger cars on Eastern and Midwestern trains were in terrible shape when Amtrak took over. So they junked a lot of them, and they moved many good cars from the west to the Eastern trains. One such train is the Broadway Limited from New York to Chicago on the old Pennsylvania line.
The last time I rode this train was about 10 years ago between Chicago and New York. I remember it as being a rather unpleasant experience. The car was dirty, it was drafty, the roadbed was rough, the service was poor, and nobody really seemed to care. Well, now, at least on this train, things are better.
I'm Lenny Pitardo from Amtrak.
Amtrak is trying to provide riders with more comfort. It is sending employees around to see if people notice any difference.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I can tell you a little bit about Amtrak. We're trying to make trains, faster trains, cleaner trains for you, and give as much service as possible. And we hope that you'll continue to patronize us. Have you seen an improvement since Amtrak has taken over?
Yeah. Trains are on time.
It's cleaner, and the food is better, and the service is better.
Good, good. How do you like Amtrak since you've taken over?
Well, I think the service has improved. I've always liked the Broadway Limited, and I'm glad that you brought it back into the state that it is now.
The roadbed is improved, but still rocky. It would take millions to smooth it out. Railroad employees are more courteous, but they still do things the old way and aren't very efficient. The food is good, the price is reasonable. But even with the improvements, it still takes 17 hours by train from New York to Chicago and only 2 hours and 10 minutes by jet plane. First-class fare on the plane is $82. On the train, a bedroom costs $110. The family car is still the train's biggest competitor, and Amtrak hasn't begun to break the automobile habit. So even though Amtrak is trying, it has not attracted nearly enough new riders. It has spent the money Congress authorized and has asked for more. It is very...
His news sources. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which is bankrupt and not getting any better financially, wants to abandon 5,000 miles of track. A small part of that right-of-way to be abandoned is in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Douglas Kiker has a report on what that could mean to the people in the area.
One of the sections of track the Penn Central wants to abandon is a 38-mile stretch that runs from York, Pennsylvania into southern Maryland, serving small towns along the way. The track was badly damaged last June by Hurricane Agnes and has not operated since then. But if this happens, one of the few solvent railroads in this country also will be put out of business, the Stewartstown Railroad, a dead-end offshoot spur line whose only connection is to the stretch of Penn Central track. The Stewartstown Railroad is only 7 miles long. There is only one little gasoline-powered engine, but when it operates, the railroad makes money hauling freight for local shippers. It has not operated since the hurricane. These days, everything comes in and goes out of the area by truck. This is more expensive, and local businessmen are hurting.
It just increases our cost data tremendously. I mean, the cost per ton to haul this, and if you have to hire trucks to haul it, or at times in the evening, we're hauling up at 10 o'clock at night. I have to get outside labor to help me haul it in, and then it puts us non-competitive in other areas, like we're close here to the M&P. Now, if a feed dealer is fortunate enough to be on the M&P, which still has rail service, fine, they're in good shape. But if you're on with us with Penn Central and have no railroad, then this just puts us completely non-competitive, and we are in a very competitive business.
The Penn Central has offered to sell its abandoned track to the Stewartstown Railroad for $2 million. The railroad says it does not have that kind of money. Local businessmen are trying to force Penn Central to reopen its section of track. And the Interstate Commerce Commission is going to have to make the final decision. Douglas Kiker, NBC News.
On Saturday, 2 Phantom jets belonging to the Air Force's Thunderbird flying team collided over Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. One plane crashed, neither pilot was seriously injured, and a German Air Force sergeant training at Holloman taxes on middle-income and upper-income workers. Congress also sent the president a bill to help 6 bankrupt railroads in the Northeast and 1 in the Middle West. The bill would merge all 7 lines in one single corporation. It would be backed by more than $2 billion in government grants and loan guarantees. One of the railroads involved is the Penn Central, the nation's biggest. Richard Hunt reports.
The Penn Central is still running, but nobody knows for how long. The people who operate the road have said it will run out of cash sometime next spring. The Interstate Commerce Commission says the road can carry on through 1974. One thing is certain. The Penn Central will lose more than $150 million this year, partly because of operations like this one. The Waverly Yard in Newark, New Jersey is still operated in about the same way it was 100 years ago. The road has neither the money nor the space to modernize it. Every day, about 1,000 freight cars are classified here by shunting them onto different tracks. About 200 cars go to competing switch yards run by competing railroads, and each of them sends 200 cars back here. The yards in Newark are competing with each other, and they're all losing money at it. The nation's industrial production comes from the areas served by the Penn Central and 6 other bankrupt railroads. The Ford Motor Company's huge Willow Run plant at Dearborn, Michigan, receives more than half of its raw materials by rail. That includes the iron and coal for the company's steel plant. About 60% of Ford's production at Willow Run is shipped out by rail, a good deal of it on the main line of the Penn Central. Ford has 22 plants on the Penn Central line, and 18 of those have no other rail service. Ford says that if the Penn Central shuts down, it will have to shut down too. So will dozens of other major industries. That's why the government has been asked to set up a new corporation to take over the bankrupt roads, merge them, and try to show a profit. The plan is endorsed by the Association of American Railroads.
The one remedy that is out of the question, I think everybody would agree, would be to just shut down this rail service that is rendered by these companies. You know, I've seen figures of the tremendous unemployment that would follow. We're talking about nearly a quarter of the railroad system in the United States here. If that remedy is out, so that the properties just can't be liquidated in front of the courthouse as you would do with a manufacturing concern that went broke, you either have to nationalize them or bring about some private enterprise solution.
The government estimates that more than 2.5 million people would lose their jobs if the bankrupt roads went out of business. The cost of reorganizing the roads will be high, as much as $5 billion. But the cost of doing nothing would be higher.
The bankrupt railroads have been crying wolf for years, but this time it seems the wolf really is at the door. Unless the government comes to the rescue, some of the roads are likely to run out of money and shut down. Then the wolf would be at everybody's door. Richard Hunt, NBC News, Dearborn, Michigan.
In Madrid today, Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco of Spain was buried. Vice President Ford represented
extra strength Effrident with twice the power against stubborn denture stains.
President Nixon signed another bill into law today in San Clemente, a law intended to prevent the closing down of 7 bankrupt railroads in the Northeast and the Middle West. The track mileage and service of the 7 roads ultimately will be less, and they'll have fewer employees, but the hope is that now at least they will continue to run. Robert Goralski has the story.
The main purpose of the act is to bail 7 major railroads out of bankruptcy. But it was the giant Penn Central which was suffering the most and needed help most desperately. $2 billion in federal money will be used to rejuvenate the lines through consolidation. A government corporation to be known as the United States Railway Association will do all the planning. By law, it is non-profit. The combined rail network to be developed will be operated by a private company, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, and it'll be encouraged to become self-sufficient and maybe even profitable. The Northeast and Midwest lines are considered vital. They run in 17 states in which half the nation's manufacturing plants are located. Transportation Secretary Claude Brinegar admitted the problem of keeping them going is a tough one.
We've got a mess on our hands in the Northeast. The area is overbuilt. The regulatory processes have kept it from being adjusted as the years have gone by. We've got bankruptcies, so we've got to work that out. Out of that will come, I think, a healthy freight system in time, protect the private sector rail freight system, and then I think better ability to handle the Northeast Corridor as a good quality passenger service.
Most railroads were in financial trouble long before the energy crisis. But the fuel shortage and the basic economy of rail transport have combined to spur the first significant overhaul of the nation's train system in history. Robert Goralski, NBC News, Washington.
At least 4 Amtrak railroad trains were stalled for hours on New Year's Day and again today. One ran out of fuel. Another had water piped into its fuel tanks instead of diesel oil. The longest delay was experienced aboard an Amtrak train which started out in Kansas City. It got stuck overnight in Jefferson City, Missouri when it ran out of fuel, apparently because of a leak in its tanks. Of the 125 passengers originally aboard the train, only 60 were left when it finally got into St. Louis. The rest were picked up by buses in Jefferson City. The train was 20 hours late getting out of St. Louis, its destination in New York City. A big gas line exploded late last night in Prairie du Rocher in southwestern Illinois. There was a fire which destroyed the buildings, but most important, the explosion left 7,000 residents without heat in near-zero weather. Coleman Young was sworn in as mayor of Detroit yesterday. Young is the first black mayor of Detroit, which is the 5th largest city in the United States.
Chocolate Phillips. It tastes good.
The Senate interrupted its fight over the filibuster rule today and voted approval of $347 million in emergency nourishment for railroads. The bulk of the money will go to the Penn Central, the rest to 6 others. The U.S. Railway Association, a federal advisory group, said today that it could cost over $7 billion to get the 7 sick railroads in the Northeast and Middle West back on their tracks. That's more than 3 times the amount the Congress has agreed to guarantee in railroad loans. The Railway Association also says that if there are drastic cutbacks in lightly used rail lines, such a system could become profitable within 3 years. This scaling back proposal is already under fire from senators and governors in the states that would be affected. The new system would be a combination of federal subsidies, loans, and private enterprise. It would be called Conrail, and here's more about it from Robert Hager.
The proposed new Conrail system would operate on 15,000 miles of existing track in the Northeast and Midwest. A great deal of that track now is in miserable shape. This film was made by Penn Central last year to show the worst of the line's problems. Repairing track will take an estimated $5 billion. Fixing the track will cost so much that today's report says it might be best for the government simply to take over ownership of the track and let the railroads pay a fee for using it. The other big problem is old, worn-out freight cars and locomotives. Penn Central says if all its cars needing repairs were lined up, the line would be 200 miles long. Repairing rolling stock will take another $2.5 billion, the second most expensive of today's recommendations. Robert Hager, NBC News.
It is one thing to make a logical calculation that parts of a rail system have to be abandoned. It's another thing to depend on one of those little-used, beat-up rail lines. The people in Doe Run, Pennsylvania, on a spur line off the Pensie's main line, depend on their railroad, and they've been talking with Richard Hunt about it.
It's safe to walk the tracks on this branch of the Penn Central. Only 3 trains a week go by, and the speed limit is 6 miles an hour because the track is so bad. The rusty Doe Run branch runs 6 1/10 miles, part of the 6,000 miles that might be cut out of the reorganized rail system. The railroad loses money on the Doe Run line, but the service is important to the half-dozen shippers along the way. The Kale and Mushroom Company needs the line to bring in corn cobs from Indiana to make compost for mushroom growers.
Manager Jim Roberts says losing rail service would mean higher prices.
Firstly, the cost of hauling corn cobs will increase significantly as we have to go further to railroad sidings to pick them up and haul them to Avondale, Pennsylvania.
The Doe Run branch also serves this 95-year-old factory, run by the Pennsylvania General Paper Company in a hamlet called Buck Run. The company brings in waste paper by rail, ships out paper towels. It employs 47 people and supports the entire population of Buck Run. Manager Ralph Bicking worries about losing rail service.
It would be quite a hardship, and I would say that'd probably mean the end of it.
And what would happen to all of your employees?
They would have to search for employment elsewhere.
Finally, the railroad comes to Doe Run. It's a farm community, and the loss of rail service probably wouldn't make much difference at this end of the line. It should not be called a one-horse town, but there's not much business here that couldn't be handled just as well by truck, even if it cost more. This spur doesn't have to be abandoned. The state could take it over, and the federal government would pay 70% of the cost. Still, the taxpayers will have to decide how badly they want this line, and it won't be cheap. Richard Hunt, NBC News, Doe Run, Pennsylvania.
For many years, the Pentagon has taken a beating on cost overruns for military projects, but the General Accounting Office of the Congress has released a report on over 250 recent federal construction projects. And the news special is about a huge new American railroad. It will come into existence at midnight. It's going to be called Conrail. Conrail combines 7 bankrupt railroads in the Northeast and the Middle West. Its purpose is to keep railroad freight service alive, just as the purpose of Amtrak is to keep passenger service going. The success of Conrail is crucial to the future of the country's railroad freight service. It is also important to the taxpayers, since Conrail begins its life with government money. Robert Hager reports.
Penn Central's daily TH3A freight headed up Crescent Mountain out of Altoona, Pennsylvania. 88 cars long, but 55 are deadheading, empty. For years, Penn Central and other lines in the Northeast and Midwest have been losing money. Tonight, Conrail takes over. Then it will be the government or the taxpayers who will risk the losses. The Conrail system is not supposed to be a government railroad. Conrail calls itself a private enterprise. But the government put Conrail in business with over $2 billion of government money. And more will be needed if Conrail doesn't make a profit. The bankrupt railroads have been below the profit line since 1968. Last year, they lost about $370 million. Conrail claims it can turn this around, break even within 3 years, and make $1 billion a year by 1985. That will be difficult. The railroads are in terrible shape. Tracks and roadbeds are bad.
It makes you run at lower speeds, where you could be doing normal speed. Passenger trains are allowed 70 mile an hour. You're permitted 60. In lots of places, you have 30 mile an hour restrictions, 10 mile an hour restrictions.
There are go-slow orders on more than 5,000 miles of the system. $19,000 railroad cars are in desperate need of repair. Some say Conrail won't work, but not Conrail's chairman, Edward Jordan.
If you want to decide in advance it can fail, fine. But if you want to look at these problems and say, what can you do to solve them, then you can get moving on them. We think that there are many things we can improve.
The men who work on the railroads believe things will improve. They blame a lot of the problems on their old bosses.
Well, I think mismanagement was the bad part to begin with, but I think under the new Conrail, I think we'll have some good management, and I think that the men will be 100% behind them.
They'll get rid of a lot of vice presidents, which we have too many of right now.
But it'll take more than that to make a profit. Conrail is counting on renegotiating the expensive union agreements it's inheriting. For example, trainmen assigned to general yard work get an extra day's pay if they're switched to a work train that handles derailments. If they go back to general yard work later, they get another extra day's pay, or 3 days' pay in one 8-hour shift. The unions will fight proposals to change work rules like these. Conrail is also counting on raising the rates it charges for freight, and it insists that in spite of that, it will pick up more business. Some economists are skeptical. They say truckers have already cut deeply into railroad business in the Northeast, where distances between shipping points are shorter, and trucks may take away even more business if railroad rates go up. The chief executive of the bankrupt Lehigh Valley Line, Robert Haldeman, predicts Conrail will always lose money.
I believe that Conrail will cost the taxpayers continuing money. I do not think that they are going to be profitable. This should go on maybe for 5 to 10 years, and then the public will begin to think in terms, well, rather than continuing to do this, perhaps we should take over and nationalize the railroads.
One ominous note, 5 years ago the government created Amtrak to rescue passenger service as Conrail is supposed to rescue freight. But instead of making a profit, Amtrak is losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
So, some see Conrail as a fresh chance to save the railroads. Others see it as another government boondoggle doomed to fail. At stake are billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. Robert Hager, NBC News in Morrisville, Pennsylvania.
So, from midnight on, Conrail. Just Conrail, and goodbye to some famous names many of us grew up with. The Lehigh Valley, the Erie Lackawanna, the Central of New Jersey, the Ann Arbor, the Lehigh and Hudson, the Reading, the New York Central, and the mighty Pennsylvania. Conrail, that's just short for Consolidated Rail Corporation.
This is Roman meal, a unique blend of whole grain wheat and rye, coarsely ground to retain all of the bran in the wheat and the rye germ. Defatted flaxseed is added, along with an extra measure of bran.
Something else that on rails is becoming too expensive is the railway post office system. Over the years, postal clerks have sorted countless millions of letters on trains thundering across the country. Most of us never saw this except as depicted in Western movies, but now it's coming to an end. Richard Hunt reports.
Ever since 1864, the railway post office has been a proud tradition of the United States mail system. In the late 1940s, there were 4,000 mail cars and 30,000 men riding them to sort the mail. Only 4 mail cars are still in service. They're used in 2 trains on the one remaining route, Washington to New York and New York to Washington, 5 nights a week. More than 50,000 pieces of mail are loaded onto each car, and the 11-man crew sorts it during the 4.5-hour trip. Foreman Jim Evans has been riding the mail cars for 40 years, and he's proud that the job gets done on time every night. Evans and his crew believe their work makes it possible for a letter mailed in New York on Wednesday to be delivered in Washington on Thursday. Mail sorted in stationary post offices and moved by freight usually takes at least a day longer. But the railway post office costs $1 million a year more than it costs to move the mail by truck or freight car. So, early Friday morning, a mail car will roll into Washington with its last load, and the service will stop. Probably forever. Richard Hunt, NBC News, on the last of the railway mail cars.
Last week, John McEnroe was an 18-year-old amateur tennis player from New York City playing in the back lots of Wimbledon. Today, he was playing Jimmy Connors in the semifinals.
Lytton is changing the way America cooks.
Our segment 3 this evening is titled Amtrak, Not a Model Railroad. Excuse the pun. Amtrak is big, expensive, not as successful a railroad as its sponsors had hoped, and it looks as though it will continue to need help from the taxpayers. At the same time, for a lot of people, it's important. Robert Hager reports.
See the country, travel Amtrak, easy come and easy go.
What's been coming and going easily at Amtrak is the money, $2 billion of it, for a service that was supposed to make money. May 1971, ceremonies inaugurate Amtrak. And John Volpe, then Secretary of Transportation, was asked about costs.
Do you expect to save any money with this operation?
The fact is that unless we save some money, this corporation won't last very long. And if we are to stay in business more than a year or two, we've got to operate it on a basis that it is going to at least start to reach a break-even point within approximately 2 or 2.5 years.
But Amtrak, now in its 7th year, has done nothing but lose money. In 1971, it lost $31 million. In 1972, it lost $148 million. Then losses of $172 million, $149 million, $281 million, $350 million. And in the just completed fiscal year, it lost $482 million. We asked John Volpe, now retired, what happened.
What happened is that, as a matter of fact, the 1,275 trains and engines we took over were very much more dilapidated than we realized. And the fact that the Congress added some routes or insisted on continuing some routes that were real money losers did not allow us to get into a break-even point.
Amtrak has made trains more appealing with new equipment, and ridership has increased some, especially in the Northeast, where Amtrak's Metroliner between Washington and New York has been very successful. But Amtrak has not made a significant change in traveling habits nationally. 11 times as many people still take airplanes. 6 times as many people ride intercity buses. And most Amtrak trains are big money losers, like the Floridian, which pulls out of Chicago at 8:30 each morning, bound for Miami, 37 hours away. The people who ride the Floridian prefer it to other ways of traveling.
I don't like to fly is the reason I don't take a plane, and I see no point in dragging a heavy car this distance for one passenger.
The scenery is just fantastic sometimes. I wanted to get away from the highways and the cars, this really gets you away.
The problem is there aren't enough people like this. The day we rode the Floridian, there were only 48 passengers leaving Chicago and 172 empty seats. Bad tracks slow down the train, and the costs are high. It costs money to run the dining car, to pay 2 waiters and 2 chefs. It costs money to run the snack car and pay the man behind the bar. It costs money to pay the trainmen and the engineers who must be replaced 10 times between Chicago and Miami because of union rules. Passengers pay $62 for a full trip ticket on the Floridian, but that's only half of what it actually costs Amtrak. Taxpayers make up the difference. Amtrak President Paul Rystra.
Floridian loses a lot of money. How can you justify hanging on to a route like that?
Well, the Floridian is our #1 loser. I think that the train runs through the wrong cities. I think this is the best example of the necessity to restructure Amtrak.
In a report issued just this week, Amtrak promises to restudy its entire system. And there are already plans to cut back some runs, mostly here in the Northeast Corridor, later this month. But so far, Amtrak has been reluctant to eliminate many of its big money-losing runs in less populated areas, because that would anger too many congressmen and senators from those places and jeopardize the yearly subsidies Congress has been voting Amtrak. Amtrak has also refused to consider the plan of former Transportation Secretary William Coleman. He wanted to reduce Amtrak to the few well-populated corridors he felt needed passenger trains. Coleman says the idea that a bigger system could be run for profit was ridiculous from the start.
Well, that wasn't true then. It's certainly not true today. And something that was supposed to be a railroad for profit now is a railroad that's draining from the general taxpayer about $900 million per year.
In spite of the losses, the outlook is that Amtrak will keep rolling and huge subsidies will keep coming.
Easy come and easy go is how you'll get there.
Robert Hager, NBC News, New York.
What's made Mr. Coffee America's favorite coffee maker?
Thousands of cups, and every one delicious.
Mr. Coffee with Coffee Saver makes great.
The long night is about to end for Penn Central. The company is about to emerge from the biggest bankruptcy in American financial history. But what will emerge is a company which doesn't resemble the railroad we all once knew. Mike Jensen has the story.
This may not look much like the Penn Central, but it is. These days, the Penn Central Transportation Company operates everything from Ferris wheels to country clubs. For years, it was one of the marvels of the railroad world. It carried freight and passengers across 17 states. Then in 1970, bankruptcy, the biggest in America's history. Today, it is almost out of railroading. But the company operates a number of other businesses. This train is a far cry from the Penn Central's old 20th Century Limited. But it's the kind of railroad that's making money for the company these days. Amusement parks, like this one in New Jersey, are an important part of the new Penn Central. Besides amusement parks, the Penn Central owns a pipeline company, an oil refinery, and property in Florida. Former passengers of the Penn Central are doing all right. Most of their commuting lines have been taken over by Conrail and regional authorities. But stockholders aren't so happy. Shares that were worth $85 10 years ago are selling for about $2 today, and may be worth even less by the time the company issues new stock. But some are optimistic. Robert Blanchett.
Essentially, every part of our business is making money now. The pipeline is making money, the refinery is making money, the parks are making money, and the real estate is making money.
It's a sign of the times that the Penn Central operates moon flumes and lightning loops and monsters and carousels. But the locomotives and cabooses have almost disappeared. Only the name Penn Central remains to remind us that it once was one of America's mightiest railroads. Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
We will not have a special...
Milwaukee. It's asked a federal judge to let it abandon all of its tracks west of a point in Montana because it says that part of the railroad loses money and the Milwaukee is almost broke. Here's Bill Sternoff in Montana.
The Milwaukee Road is just about out of money. Company officials say it's because the western part of their system is unprofitable. Critics say it's because the railroad is mismanaged. The Milwaukee has been through bankruptcy proceedings twice, and now it's asking the government for permission to abandon service in the west, from Miles City, Montana to Seattle. In recent years, the Milwaukee Road has lost 2/3 of its business in the west to competing lines. The railroad used to run 6 freights a day along these rails in central Montana, but now there are only 2. And if the Milwaukee has its way, soon there will be none. Given permission, the Milwaukee will abandon all but 3,500 of its 10,000 miles of track. It will lay off 4,000 workers, and towns like Harleton, Montana will suffer. Harleton, a town of 1,400, has a railroad payroll of $2.5 million a year. Residents are worried. Some have worked for the Milwaukee 30 years or more.
I'm too old to start over. And we like it here. We've got our roots here.
Milwaukee officials aren't very sympathetic. Spokesman Wallace Abbey.
We are not in the business of employing people. We are in the business of running a railroad, running a company for profit.
Western states and businesses are lobbying to keep the Milwaukee. A consortium wants to buy it. If the line disappears, it will be difficult to ship badly needed low-sulfur coal from Montana and South Dakota. Some grain shipments will have to move by truck. And while the Milwaukee Road tries to survive on what's left in the east, places like Harleton may turn into ghost towns. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Harleton, Montana.
The Associated Press, the Associated Press reports that ABC has won the television rights for the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, and the price is reported to be $200 million.
Bayer Aspirin, 100% pure pain reliever for arthritis pain.
Our special segment this evening is about passenger travel on American railroads. There's an argument. Some people say that the United States needs a working passenger train service. The Europeans and the Japanese have superb trains. But the Reagan administration says federal money spent on passenger subsidies is money spent only on nostalgia. John Dancy has been looking into this.
The Southwest Limited, an hour and a half out of Chicago, headed west across the Illinois prairie at more than 90 miles an hour. It will arrive in Los Angeles 40 hours later, 10 minutes ahead of schedule, after a journey of more than 2,000 miles across the heart of America. The news is that long-distance train travel, the kind that lives in American legend and song, is enjoying a renaissance. Amtrak's trains are clean, modern, comfortable. In March, 87% of all Amtrak trains ran on time, and more people are riding the trains. But just when all that is happening, the Reagan administration is demanding that Amtrak's budget be cut. Amtrak officials say that would wipe out all their gains. The man calling for cuts is Robert Blanchett, a feisty Washington lawyer who heads the Federal Railroad Administration. He wants Amtrak to get by on $613 million a year, one-third less than the Carter administration had requested for Amtrak.
You have to remember that $613 million is still a lot of money. And we think that by innovation in the fare system, by increasing productivity, and by management cuts, Amtrak can fill its statutory needs very comfortably within the strictures of that budget.
But Amtrak President Alan Boyd says even higher fares and increased productivity wouldn't be enough to save long-distance trains.
If the original proposal of the Reagan administration becomes law, it would mean that Amtrak would be effectively relegated to the state service of the Northeast Corridor, the 8 northeastern states, with no service to the rest of the country.
I need a one-way ticket out.
The problem is that passenger trains do not earn enough in fares to pay their own way. To keep the Southwest Limited running to La Junta, Colorado, and Galesburg, Illinois, and Newton, Kansas, the government, that is the taxpayers, pays a subsidy to Amtrak.
Board! Board!
The average subsidy is $35 per passenger, but on long-distance trains, it costs the taxpayers much more.
This train, the Southwest Limited, is one of the most heavily subsidized in the country. Every time somebody buys a ticket on this train, his fellow citizens subsidize him to the tune of $137. It's that the Reagan administration wants to end.
Morning on the plains. In the dining car kitchen, 4 chefs are working. All the food is fresh, not prepackaged. If you order eggs, they come out of a skillet, not a microwave. The same dining car crew makes the entire trip, serving 3 meals a day. Not so the train crews. Union rules on train staffing are so tight that the Southwest Limited must use 13 engine crews and 8 train crews to travel from Chicago to Los Angeles. That's 55 people at a cost of more than $10,000. That's one reason subsidies are so high on the Southwest Limited.
We're paying too much for labor. We've got to wipe out the archaic work rules and manning agreements. On many of our runs, the average length of time the train crew is on is about 3.5 to 4 hours, for which they get a full day's pay. And we've got to get more than that.
Amtrak officials want Congress to restore money the administration cut from Amtrak's budget. In return, Amtrak has pledged to have every train paying its own way by 1985, partly by raising fares. The administration may be happy about that, but the passengers aren't.
Our great white fathers took our gas away from us. Then they want to take the wheels away from us. They're going to put us on our feet. Walking.
I love it. I think it's the best thing that's been kept alive and part of our heritage, and they shouldn't take it away from us.
But to money men like Robert Blanchett, it's not a question of heritage, it's a question of business.
There is no doubt that much of the service that Amtrak operates is an anachronism, where there is more of an element of nostalgia than there is an element of need.
So, there is a basic split. Amtrak says trains like the Southwest Limited serve a need. The Reagan administration says all they serve is nostalgia, and that's too expensive. Caught somewhere in the middle are the passengers, the people both Amtrak and the administration claim to be serving. John Dancy, NBC News, aboard the Southwest Limited.
purchasing countries and the Soviet Union have been the big sellers. In Washington, other financial concerns. Here again, Roger Mudd.
There are a dozen bits and pieces of economic news floating about tonight. Federal Reserve Board Chairman Volcker says we are turning the corner on inflation. Presidential Economic Advisor Wiedenbaum predicts a recovery, maybe not by spring, but certainly by fall. Speaker O'Neill says the recession will be long and severe. The Americans for Democratic Action say what's needed is a New Deal-type priming of the pump. And in Oklahoma City, the governors of Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma are meeting to try to bring back a famous American railroad from bankruptcy. Dan Molina reports.
The rolling stock of the once proud Rock Island Railroad sits rusting in yards like this throughout the Midwest. The decision to be made now is whether all this becomes scrap iron or whether the line can somehow be revived. Today, governors from 3 states and representatives from 10 others discussed that decision with William Gibbons, the trustee of the bankrupt railroad. The states say the line is essential.
Without rail service in some communities, literally communities can be shut down.
Well, the Rock Island line, she's a mighty good road.
Many towns in the central United States owe their existence to the Rock Island line. For more than a century, the railroad was a lifeline for farmers hauling their grain to market.
You're right and I may be wrong, but you're gonna miss me when I'm gone.
Today, trucks do the hauling. Using trucks, however, adds about 2% to the cost of each bushel, and that price is paid by farmers already facing rough times.
It's just one more stick in the kindling of the fire.
Boonville, Arkansas is one of many towns where the Rock Island line was the only major transportation artery. For one of the town's largest employers, increased transportation costs are now a serious burden, and plans for expansion are on the shelf.
I think the proof of rail necessary for our operation is our very facility itself, which has a rail siding completely inside the plant.
Because of the recession, a private sale of the Rock Island line is unlikely. Its trustee says if the railroad is to roll again, the states involved will have to come up with millions of dollars in subsidies. Dan Molina, NBC News, El Reno, Oklahoma.
The Coalition for Better Television, which is run by the Reverend Donald Wildman of Tupelo, Mississippi, today.
There is something so endearing about them, including their name, caboose. Even in this era of space-age travel, nearly everyone knows it is the caboose that brings up the rear of a train. The origin of that name, by the way, caboose, is unknown. And unfortunately, before too long, the caboose itself will be unknown. Frank Burkholzer tells us it has now reached the end of the line.
One by one, they're being taken off the trains, shunted aside. The caboose, a venerable fixture of American railroading, is obsolete, unwanted. It was developed, the caboose, for several serious purposes. It was an observation post at the end of the train, where the conductor and the brakeman could look ahead for signs of trouble, monitor the air brake pressure on the last car. Very useful as trains became longer and longer. For generations, each conductor had his own caboose, his home away from home, decorated to his own taste. He and his crew ate, slept, and worked in it. Now, computers which sort out the individual freight cars keep the records conductors used to handle. Electronic sensors every 25 miles test the wheels as the cars roar by. The crews sleep and eat in town, but they miss the old caboose.
Oh yeah, I hate to see it go.
Yes, I think it's unsafe. You don't have any men on the rear of that train to see if anything's going wrong.
Kind of like when the caboose goes, it's going to be like when the steam engine's going, you know. It'll never be the same.
When the caboose goes, something has to replace it on the end of the train, and that something is called end-of-train device. It monitors the air brake pressure on the last car and displays it for the engineer up in front. So this end-of-train device, which costs $6,000, replaces this end-of-train device, which cost $85,000.
We, as a crew, we hate to see the cabooses going. Like I say, that's progress.
With progress, you win a little and you lose a little. And one of the things you'll lose is the view from the caboose. Frank Burkholzer, NBC News on the Santa Fe.
That's nightly news for this Monday night. I'm Tom Brokaw. Of the U.S. dollar tumbling today. America's railroads have a drinking problem, and it's a killer. In just the past year, alcohol or drug use by train crews was a factor in 2 derailments that left 7 people dead. Robert Hager reports tonight that federal safety officials are running out of patience.
In 1982, this train wreck in Louisiana was caused by a drunken engineer who fell asleep while his girlfriend drove the train. In April 1984, this freight collision in Colorado and another in Wyoming were caused by engineers who fell asleep after drinking or using marijuana. All of which led John Riley, chief of the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, to make a highly publicized trip last spring to inspect the wreckage. He promised he and his boss, Transportation Secretary Dole, would adopt a regulation soon.
With Mrs. Dole, Elizabeth made action on alcohol and drug her #1 priority in the railroad industry, and she really means it. So do I.
Now, almost 2 years after beginning consideration of a rule, there's still nothing on the books. Today, the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, James Burnett, said that was a remarkable and insensitive delay.
I believe the rule is long overdue. It's time to get it off the siding. It's time for the FRA administrator to put pen to paper and promulgate the rule.
Drunk driving in a car is a crime. Pilots can't drink for 8 hours before flying, but no federal law would prevent an engineer from downing a bottle of whiskey at the throttle. But today, Railroad Administrator Riley said the charge of delay was unfounded.
It's very easy to say write a rule. To write one correctly, to write one that's effective for the public and protects the individual's rights is much harder. That's what we're doing, that's what we intend to do, and we're not going to rush it until it's done right, nor are we going to slow it down when it's finished.
Final approval is still months away. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
Former football star Jim Brown pleaded not guilty today to charges that he raped and beat a school teacher at his home in the Hollywood Hills.